It was never meant to leave the palace walls. The things he said, the things he felt. But sometimes when the silence in your own home grows too loud, someone ends up hearing it. And this time it was the whole country. At the heart of it all stood Edward Hargrove, not a noble, not a politician, just a quiet man in a worn-out suit who had spent years in the shadows of Buckingham Palace. He was the personal secretary to King Charles, the guy who brewed tea when the night got long, who knew which drawer held Charles's handwritten letters, who heard the king speak when there were no cameras and no script. And when Edward sat down for a low-key TV interview in a dull old studio outside London, nobody expected what would follow. There was no dramatic music, no breaking news alert, just a man's tired voice breaking open the illusion of the crown. He spoke slowly, carefully, but every word hit like a hammer. Because what he revealed wasn't just gossip, it was pain. Real, raw, royal pain. Charles, behind all the ceremonies and perfectly timed smiles, was falling apart. Edward painted the picture clearly. Nights at Highgrove where the king sat motionless in a leather chair, staring out at the trees like he wasn't really there, his white hair a little messier than usual, his eyes red, his body curled up like he just lost something but couldn't name what it was. And in those quiet hours, Charles spoke. Not like a king, but like a man who felt trapped. "It's a golden prison," he once said, holding a cup of tea gone cold. "This isn't a life, it's a sentence." What shocked people the most wasn't the talk about stress or exhaustion. It was who he blamed. Not Parliament, not the press, but Camilla. Yes, Camilla, the woman the world had come to see as his great love, his support after decades of public heartbreak. But in that interview, Edward shared something very different. According to Charles, Camilla wasn't lifting him up, she was holding him down. Edward didn't shout it, he didn't sensationalize it, but the image he gave was damning. Charles, worn out from state duties, would come home hoping for peace, but instead of comfort, he got a schedule. Events, dinners, public appearances he didn't want to attend, all designed by Camilla. Not for the kingdom, but for her. "She needs the spotlight," Charles had said, voice cracking. "And I just want to breathe." At first, the reaction was disbelief. How could the man who had once fought so hard for Camilla be saying this? But then came the headlines, then the hashtags. Royal secrets, Charles speaks, Camilla control. The story exploded. People weren't just talking, they were choosing sides. Some saw Charles as a victim of an unloving marriage, manipulated by a woman obsessed with royal image. Others accused him of betrayal, airing his personal regrets on national television. But all of that was just noise. Because inside Clarence's house, the real storm was beginning. Camilla found out the same way everyone else did, from the morning paper. One look at the headline and her hands began to shake, her face flushed red. By the time she stormed into Charles's study, the rage had already hit full speed. "You've humiliated me," she shouted in front of the entire nation. Charles didn't flinch. He looked her dead in the eye and said, "Because it's true." And just like that, the palace walls shook, not from the echo of angry voices, but from something deeper, something more dangerous. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the start of war, and Camilla, furious and cornered, was already preparing her first strike. The dismissal letter came before breakfast. Folded neatly and delivered in silence, it didn't need an explanation. Every name on that list was handpicked by Camilla. People Charles trusted, people who had served him for years. Gone. One by one, they packed their things. No formal goodbyes, just quiet nods and solemn eyes. Even the palace walls felt colder. Charles stood in his room, robe hanging loosely off his shoulders, holding the list with hands that trembled. Not out of fear, but fury. It wasn't just staff being shuffled, it was his life gutted. Camilla had struck fast and deep, and the king had been left out of his own decisions. In the official papers, it was called a staff restructure under the Queen Consort's directive. But behind closed doors, everyone knew what it really was: a purge. She replaced them with her people, nephews, distant cousins, family friends who had never set foot in service before. They came with polished shoes, forced smiles, and hidden agendas. At meetings, they laughed too hard at Camilla's jokes, nodded too eagerly at her speeches, and looked through Charles like he was just another antique in the palace. But the worst part? They weren't just ignoring him, they were provoking him. During lunch, someone made a snide remark about Charles's latest TV drama, as if the confession had been a publicity stunt. Another time, when he hesitated during a speech rehearsal, a staffer leaned in and muttered, "That's why the queen leads now." He didn't respond, but his silence wasn't weakness. It was the calm before eruption. One brave soul, a longtime attendant named Thomas, had refused to follow Camilla's orders. He stood up during a private briefing and said, "We serve the crown, not the ego of one person." Camilla's response was ice cold. She stared at him for a long second, then picked up a silver tray and threw it across the room. Cups shattered. No words, just the sound of fury. "Get him out," she said. That night, Thomas didn't go home. He went straight to Princess Anne. Kneeling, he poured out everything: the purge, the humiliation, the commands to sabotage the king's morale. Anne listened silently, her expression unreadable until the end. Then she stood and said only 4 words: "It ends right now." The next morning, Anne walked into the palace unannounced. She didn't ask for permission, she didn't knock. Charles joined her, a silent force by her side. Together, they entered the central hall where Camilla was preparing to introduce her new staff, her loyal replacements. The timing was perfect. Camilla, standing at the podium with her chin high, was mid-sentence when the grand doors swung open. Flashbulbs popped. Reporters flooded in. At the center of the wave was Charles, flanked by Anne and Thomas. The room froze. Charles motioned to Thomas. The former attendant stepped forward, voice firm, eyes burning with quiet rage. "I was ordered to treat the king with disrespect. I was called a servant, a nobody. When I refused to obey, I was humiliated and thrown out." Gasps spread like wildfire. Cameras clicked. Reporters scrambled for every word. Camilla stood frozen, eyes wide, mouth slightly parted. But no sound came out. Anne stepped up. "Don't even try to deny it. I've spoken to others. Your little empire of control is crumbling." Camilla opened her mouth, but Charles spoke over her. "You've taken my trust, my peace. Now you want to turn my home into your stage. No more." And just like that, the monarchy stopped being quiet. What had once been whispered in corners was now live on camera for millions to see. And Camilla, once the image of quiet authority, now looked exactly like what the world feared: desperate, angry, exposed. The aftermath wasn't chaos, it was clarity. The palace, once a fortress of secrets, had been ripped open in public view, and while Camilla scrambled to defend herself, the tide had already turned. The footage from the confrontation played on loop across television networks. Social media timelines were flooded with clips, commentary, and breakdowns. Memes, threads, think pieces, everyone had something to say. But one thing was clear: the illusion had shattered. Camilla tried to recover. She released a video statement the next morning, standing alone in a perfectly arranged room with golden drapes and royal portraits behind her. She spoke of duty, responsibility, and loyalty to the crown. She claimed her actions were meant to preserve the strength of the monarchy and protect the throne from internal instability, but the polished speech fell flat. No one bought it. The public had seen too much. They'd seen her scream, they'd seen her throw objects, silence voices, and twist loyalty into control, and most importantly, they saw Charles not as a king trying to escape responsibility, but as a man trying to reclaim his life. Even inside the palace, the shift was undeniable. Camilla's new hires avoided her, unsure of their standing. Whispers turned into full conversations. More former staff came forward. They spoke of intimidation, manipulation, and the constant push to isolate Charles from anyone who truly cared for him. What had started as a scandal became a movement, and at its center was Charles, vulnerable, wounded, but finally seen. Anne stood by him not for appearance, but because she knew the stakes. The monarchy wasn't just about crowns and ceremonies. It was about people, flawed, tired, real. And she refused to let it be poisoned from the inside. A week later, in a closed-door meeting at Clarence House, Camilla was asked to step away from her duties indefinitely. No official titles were stripped, no harsh punishment, but the message was clear: her reign of control was over. She left the palace in silence, escorted through a back gate to avoid cameras. Her car pulled away slowly, the iron gates closing behind her like the end of a chapter no one wanted to reopen. For Charles, it wasn't a moment of victory. There were no celebrations, just a quiet walk through the garden that afternoon, his steps slow, his eyes scanning the trees he'd once watched in silence. Anne joined him, saying nothing. They didn't need words. Days passed, the halls grew quieter. New staff were brought in, carefully selected by Charles himself, not based on titles or connections, but on trust, loyalty, human decency. He made it clear, no more games, no more power plays, just honesty.